Hi, we continue today in Revelation 16 as the sixth seal continues to unfold. Unique to all the others, there's not only a response of those who blaspheme God and then refuse to repent, but an actual response, a strategy and a plot that will move the larger story of the impending war forward. So let's begin to look at the story of the three foul spirits like frogs coming from the mouth of the dragon and the mouth of the beast and the mouth of the false prophet. So on the right side of the screen, you see, as I've been following throughout chapter 16, what in purple the angels do and then what the effect of it is. And so as we've been seeing, there's been this sequence of first the three angels and then the explanation for why this is justified, then the next set of three angels, and before the seventh angel, this expanded section here. And to make sense of that, we need to see how it's parallel in a number of ways to what we've seen elsewhere. So in the trumpets and bowls, here we see they both had, at this point, the Euphrates, and then they both had things coming out of the mouth that was symbolic of propaganda. So there at the end of this sequence, we saw the fire, smoke, and sulfur come from the mouth of the beast from the abyss. And here we see three foul frog spirits from the mouth of the dragon, the beast, and the false prophet. Which is to say, we need to be looking closely at the parallels between not only the trumpets and the bowls, but between this chapter and chapter 13, where we met the beast and the dragon. We met the dragon earlier in chapter 12. So what I've done here is just present a few of the parallels, and this is excerpted. This is the first four verses of chapter 13, and then 11 to 18 below, and then Revelation 16, 2, and 10, and 13 to 16, to try to find the parts that match. So red relates to the dragon and his throne here, and you see that on both sides. The purple relates to worship, so worshiping the dragon who gave his authority to the beast, and they worship the beast. And here we see those who had the mark of the beast and worshiped its image. The green there for the mark of the beast is paralleled here with those who cannot buy or sell without the mark of the beast, and which is to say the name of the beast and the number of its name. And then we see the commonality of performing signs, here to deceive the inhabitants of the earth, and here to go abroad to the kings of the whole world. So back here, it was the generic reality that there was this ongoing situation, and John's audience would have heard this as applying to them, that some of the locals within the patronage system are trying to raise up the empire and the emperor as clients so that the emperor will provide things for them. And so they are full of praise for the divine authority of the emperor, what scholars can sometimes call the emperor cult. And that would have originated, not in the sense of that it started there, but rather than coming from Rome, it started in Ephesus. So not originating in sense of time, but in terms of place. That it wasn't something mandated by, in this case, the symbol of the dragon, but of the beast, who are trying to persuade people. So back there we saw in chapter 13 the attempt to deceive the inhabitants of the earth that this beast who had been killed was alive, and now we see it in terms of gathering for this war. So let's look at a couple other things that frame our story, and then we'll look at the details in the story. So as we've seen here, we're going to deal with something about frogs, but there aren't actual frogs. It's spirits like frogs, but certainly the impression of frogs connects us with the Exodus story. And in the Hebrew Bible, frogs are only mentioned in this story, and then in two Psalms that retell the story of the plagues in the Exodus. So there are no actual frogs in the Hebrew Bible except in the Exodus story. And there are no frogs here either. These are spirits like frogs, and one of the questions is going to be is, what about a frog is like the spirit, or maybe the other way around, what about the spirit is like a frog? And so we'll have to look at that in a second. Before we look at the details, just something about the larger plot. So this is responding to after the sixth angel pours his bowl on the great river Euphrates and its water was dried up in order to prepare the way for the kings from the east. And we saw last time that is echoing a passage from Isaiah 44 and others that suggest not only that God has the power to dry up the rivers, just in terms of being the creator, but also the power to do this to enable there to be a war of justice on behalf of God's people. So in the Isaiah section, it's drying up the Euphrates so that the Persians can come and defeat the Babylonians and release the exiles, and they can return to Jerusalem, which is the thrust of that center section of Isaiah that scholars have largely called Second Isaiah, although not so much these days. So what we can hear in that then is this is a preparation for war against the dragon and the beast, which is to say the kings from the east, representing Persia and the traditional enemies to the east of Rome, are preparing for battle, and therefore we see this response. And so let's look at the map for a little bit just to get an idea of what that would seem like to the audience. So as we saw last time, here's the Euphrates, and here would be Persia over here, Parthia at that time, and that certainly would have been a perennial enemy. And then the audience is here, And so here's Ephesus and Smyrna and Sardis and Pergamum that you can see there. And then Rome, of course, is over here. So this scene taking place, which they're seeing here, and of course John is on the island of Patmos out here, is anticipating a river over here that's dried up, so kings from over here can come this way. And so the story we're hearing is, therefore, the powers that be in Rome are hearing about that, and they're gathering for this battle that's about to take place. But it's not even exactly about to take place quite yet. And so let's look a little more detail of this, and then we can proceed through this a little farther and see how John is presenting this to his audience. So 3 foul spirits like frogs, literally unclean spirits. We'll see unclean a couple more times in relation to Babylon. And then spirits like frogs. As you can see in this image from the 11th century, and there are many like this you could find out there as well, artists have often had trouble portraying this other than as frogs coming out of the mouth. But that's, of course, not exactly what's being described here. So let's look a little more closely at the language and what people have understood by the presence of frogs or the symbol of frogs. So you can see down in my note below, the word is bakrakosi in Greek here. It's only here, and here's the Hebrew word. But there are a number of understandings of what frogs might mean. So let's look at a few of them from my notes, and I'll put it up here so you can see it in a bigger part of the screen here. So Bruce Molina, in his piece on trying to read this entire book from the perspective of actually looking up at the stars and elements in the sky, suggests that in the astronomical traditions of Arab Bedouins, there are 2 well-known stars called the frogs. Whether the tradition of Arab Bedouins is relevant to John's audience of people in the cities of Roman Asia is another question. The scholar Mount suggests, quoting the scholar Schick, that in reference to Persian religion east of the Euphrates, in which, quote, frogs were considered to be instruments of Ahriman, the god of darkness. And that would make sense perhaps out of one of the bulls that we saw that cast them into darkness. But here the issue isn't darkness. The issue is things that come out of the mouth. So the issue of darkness there probably isn't exactly on point. Another scholar, Beale, notes that frogs can be a symbol of confusing deceptive sound as interpreting the Exodus frogs from Jewish writings, which is not from the Bible, from other writings. And in fact, we'll come back to that in another second, another funny story from the Midrash about frogs. Philo, according to Craig Kester, notes that, and this is quoting from Kester, some interpreters assume that frogs signify impurity, but according to rabbinic tradition, frogs do not convey uncleanness, and that's a cite to the Midrash there. Rather, ancient writers compared empty speech and flattery to the meaningless croaking of frogs. So at least we're getting closer to it there. There's the issue of the sound of frogs, which would make more sense out of the coming out of the mouths than something about touching frogs or impurity from frogs. So we see there's nothing really about frogs themselves that are negative. It's more the sound that is being associated here as something coming out of the mouth. The one story from Jewish tradition that's not biblical about frogs is a curious one about a Rabbi Hanina who is given a gift, and he opens the box and he finds a live frog in it. And he begins to take care of the frog, and he finds that the frog can speak. And he teaches the frog Torah, and he teaches the frog different languages, and they become friends. And eventually the frog reveals to the rabbi that the frog was a spirit sent from God to be able to take different forms to accompany him, and settles on with the man and his wife, and the man becomes rich and becomes admired by kings. And so in that little story that's taken from Louis Ginsburg's collection, The Legends of the Jews, I couldn't find an original citation of where Ginsburg got it from, but that's a collection that he made in the early 20th century of a number of midrashic passages. There it shows a frog as nothing negative about it at all. And of course, in the Exodus story, there's nothing bad about the frogs. They just take up space. They don't bite, they don't kill, they don't sting, they don't eat the crops, they don't pollute the water like blood. They just pile up, and eventually their piled up dead bodies are stinky, but that would be true about any piled up dead bodies. So there's really nothing negative about frogs. It's really just a vehicle for describing what's coming out of the mouth of these 3 demonic alternatives to God. So as we see then, this is the response to what was done by the angel to dry up the Euphrates. And we see now that the Trinity here is going to be gathering those who go abroad, performing sign to go abroad to the kings of the whole world to assemble them for battle on the great day of God the Almighty. And so we see in this response to the 6th bowl being poured out, the beginning of preparations for this battle from both sides. So from the dragon side, a propaganda campaign to go out to the kings of the whole world to take on the kings of the east. And this is certainly be understood, as we saw last time, from Isaiah 44 of God's ability to dry up the river in order to bring In that time, King Cyrus of Persia and the other Persians to defeat the Babylonians and allow the Judean exiles to return and rebuild Jerusalem. And so apparently that's what we can understand is happening here. The dragon and the beast are understanding that the drying up of the river is preparing for God to send forces here, so they're trying to go on a propaganda campaign around the whole world to build up an alliance that would take on this campaign of the kings of the East. Whether they know it's on behalf of God or not, we can't know, and the story doesn't say. But they're clearly said to be demonic spirits, and we only have seen demons a couple of times earlier in Revelation. One was at the end of the trumpets, when we saw that the people who refused to repent continued to worship idols and demons that they had made out of their own hands. And then we see it here, and then we'll see it that Babylon is the haunt of unclean demons. And so, as we saw in the parallel with chapter 13, performing signs, which is to say spectacles and speeches and various acts of propaganda to get people to take their side in this coming battle. The word in Greek here to go abroad is to say from the Leda lexicon, to move out of an enclosed or well-defined 2- or 3-dimensional area, which is to say to moving out of Rome's area into this field of battle here. To the kings of the whole world, in this case using the word okumenes, which Christian listeners here might recognize from the English word ecumenical or ecumenism, taken from this Greek word. In current parlance, ecumenism refers to dialogue amongst different Christian groups, but in the original context back in the 1st century, the ecumene was the realm that Rome controlled, the civilized world, not the whole earth, but the realm of civilization. And so they're going out to build a wide alliance, as empires did, against the threat that they see coming from the east, and assemble them for battle. And battle is, the word for battle is polemos, the word for war. And we see war in Revelation a number of times, and I've already posted this chart earlier. The red ones are the battles of the beast, and the black ones are the battles either between the beast and God's people, but when God's side wins. And we saw that earlier in chapter 13 and 12, the dragon seemed to be winning, starting back in chapter 11 when it was defeating the witnesses. But now the tide is turning. And so the scene we're seeing beginning here will continue, and as I've already noted, will continue finally into chapter 19 and 20, when that battle will take place in just the blink of an eye. And what we're being revealed to us here, and probably not to the dragon and the beast, is this battle will take place on the great day of God the Almighty, which is we also heard in chapter 6:17, which is right around the same time as the cry of those under the altar, when will there be justice and judgment. So we heard that cry back then, and now it's beginning to come closer. And this is the great irony here, that the battle between the beast and the dragon and these other kings might seem like a traditional battle for territory and power amongst human rulers, but it's actually God's day of great judgment. Much like Persia coming to defeat the Babylonians was understood that Persian king was a Messiah on behalf of God. And then, right in the middle of that story, comes this verse, like a thief. And that's exactly what it says. See, I am coming like a thief. Blessed is the one who stays awake and is clothed, not going about naked and exposed to shame. And as many scholars have said, this verse comes out of nowhere. The next verse goes back to the question of preparing for battle. So let's look at a little bit about how it fits in here. As scholar Boring noted in 1992, the divine word comes like a thief, unannounced and without warning. And as another scholar, I think, pretty sure this is Giblin, here it is, notes that this enlargement of the sixth bowl, as we saw earlier, this section here that extended out from the bowl, parallels the enlargement of the sixth seal back in chapter 7, and also the enlargement of the sixth trumpet in chapter 10 with the witnesses, both as acts of preparation for what is being described as coming soon. And so here, this comes like a thief to suggest that those who think this stately gathering of forces in this propaganda campaign will go on a long time, we can wait, and yet maybe the battle won't come suddenly at once, but God in the form of Jesus and the Lamb will come suddenly, like a thief. And this coming like a thief is common to the synoptics. It's one of the rare little sayings that is common to the synoptics in Revelation. We also heard it back in chapter 3 in the messages to the ecclesia back there. And so the image here continues with this interesting metaphor: blessed is the one who stays awake and is clothed, not going about naked and exposed to shame. This is the third of 7 Beatitudes in Revelation. Let's look at those here. It may be curious that 3/4 of the way through the book we only have 3 of the Beatitudes, but most of them will come as a result of the end of the war and the revealing of New Jerusalem, and that's where the real blessing will be. So third of 7, the one who stays awake and is clothed. And I have to make a note here, given the time I'm making this video, that we're in a moment where so many Christians out there are having a campaign against being awake. Whether that's in Florida with the Anti-Woke Act or various things where the African-American tradition of being awake, which is to say being aware of how you're a victim of injustice and racism and aware of how it happened and prepared and awake to have a moment when you can fight against it, is what's being called for here. And yet it's ironic that in our moment Christians are the ones saying, no, go back to sleep. Even though, as you can see from my note, the call to stay awake is 22 times in the New Testament. And here the description goes on, not just to stay awake, but to be clothed, not going about naked and exposed to shame. So there's 2 ways to interpret this image. One is that this moment will come when you're asleep in bed and could be asleep naked, and then the emergency comes, you have to run out naked, and that would expose you to shame. But another option, as Giblin notes, is it could describe the vanquished shame by being led naked into captivity. That doesn't seem as likely here because the issue is around being awake, not taken captive, and we've seen a description of being taken captive earlier in Revelation. This seems like it's more about being naked in bed and not being exposed to shame. This is the only time in Revelation we hear the question of shame here, although it's many times in Leviticus 18, not just in verse 6, around the shame of nakedness. But here it's not the literal nakedness, it's a metaphorical nakedness, much like we might see at the end of Mark's Gospel, where the young man at the tomb runs away naked from the crucifixion of Jesus. And then we get to our final verse for the day here. And ironically, a verse that is perhaps one of the most famous, or at least that's one of the most famous images in the book of Revelation, but one that's only mentioned here. They assembled at the place that in Hebrew is called Harmageddon. And my note highlights the more usual spelling of that as Armageddon, but this is the only place this is mentioned anywhere in the Bible. Harmageddon literally means Mount Megiddo, but there is no Mount Megiddo. My note suggesting Mount Megiddo is actually not accurate, but there is a pass. And here's the pass. You can see it literally now. It's just this mound. It's the pass across toward the Jezreel Valley. And here from Google Maps, you can see where Megiddo is. It's in a relatively obscure place for John's audience. This is not a big city. It's not on the coast. It's not a place that Rome would be concerned with. But curiously, archaeologically, it has 26 layers of habitation going back over 3,000 years. So it was certainly continuously a habited place, but not one of political or strategic significance of any kind at all. But it does have echoes in Hebrew scripture we saw last time, this echo from 2 Kings 23:29 here, where King Josiah died suddenly in battle there, and again, in the hands of the Egyptians. So it's associated with death and also another royal death in 1 Kings 9:15, but not associated with a major battle and not associated with any particular cosmic event. And yet there it is, and it'll come back to us not by name, but in the final battles in chapter 19 and 20. But before we get to that, we have to get to the 7th angel and the fall of Babylon. So we'll begin to continue that journey in our next video. See you then. Bye-bye.